Professor of History at Louisiana State University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to Roundtable 4A, Diversifying Directions and New Perspectives on the French and Francophone 18th Century. This is a roundtable. I want to say just 2 words about this panel, which is truly a child, I think, of the pandemic. But Burson and I began talking about this roundtable, I think in the early days of the pandemic. And the conversations that are going to unfold today have been nurtured. I want to say special thanks to Dan Watkins and to Megan Roberts, who unfortunately wasn't able to make the conference, for the wonderful French and Francophone Enlightenment online workshop that they began during the pandemic, sustained us, and continues on. And if you would like to join us, Dan would be the person to speak to. So without further ado, let's see, I guess I should go in the order that is in the program, because those are the rules, and I believe that means we begin with staff. Oh, it's Angela. Okay, so I put it in that. Okay, Angela Haas is Associate Professor of History at Missouri Western State University. She has been the recipient of a grant from the Mellon Foundation and of the Natalie Zeman Davis Award from the Society of French Historical Studies. A specialist on the treatment of miraculous healing in 18th century France, she is at work on a book titled Miracles in the Press, Religious Authority and Intellectual Autonomy in Enlightenment France. Thanks, guys. We appreciate it. Okay, so we didn't actually have titles, but my title is to give you a sense of what's happening here. Recovering the voices of female patients in Enlightenment France, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. So until relatively recently, the voices of women were nearly silent in the history of medicine. Since the turn of the 21st century, their voices have begun to make their way into studies of medical practice and theory. For example, there have now been many excellent studies on female practitioners in France, and there's also been a lot of good work done on understandings of the female body and the so-called maladie des femmes. Although these studies certainly place women at the forefront of the history of medicine, they focus primarily on either female practitioners or on male views of the female body, like legal experts, medical practitioners, or medical theorists. Thus, while they focus on issues that undoubtedly affected the medical care of women, they don't give us a keen sense of what it was like to be a female patient in Enlightenment France. Most attempts to examine the female experiences of medical care focus on practitioners' casebooks or correspondence letters. The former, again, most accurately gives us a view of the practitioners, while the latter largely reflect the experience of elite women. So here I want to propose other sources that can give us insights into the experience of female patients, even those of modest social standing, which have yet to be analyzed within the context of medical history. One of the biggest challenges when trying to get at the experience of any patient is that most sources that focus on the progression of the disease and a treatment regimen over time are written by medical practitioners rather than patients. There are few circumstances under which patients would be asked to recount their experiences with medical practitioners. One set of sources that I have extensive experience with is accounts of miraculous cures. These accounts required extensive details about the entire course of medical treatment to prove that the patient was incurable, and thus that a miracle had indeed occurred. There are several hundreds of these accounts published between the 1730s and the 1780s, most of them focusing on miracles meant to encourage the Archbishop of Paris to launch official church proceedings to investigate them, with the ultimate goal of proving divine support for the Jansenist cause. Although I've examined many of these accounts extensively in the past, I've read them in a very different way. So I focused on the statements of editors of the collections, for example, and particularly the stress that they placed on the importance of witness testimony, which often followed the first-hand accounts of the healed person themselves. I've also drawn on these accounts, particularly those between the 1750s and 1780s, to show how a lack of effective medical treatments was crucial for both the survival of the miracle tradition and for the popularity of mesmerism later in the century. Recently, I returned to these accounts, and I'm growing convinced that these could be actually a very valuable source for uncovering the experiences of female patients during this period. Although accounts of the healing miracle itself are relatively uniform, the accounts of the illness that preceded them and the relationship that they had with their practitioners varied widely. For the sake of this presentation, I've examined around 50 of these accounts published in the early 1730s. They vary in length from about 2 to 5 pages on average, and about 3/4 of the accounts focus on women, most of them from relatively humble backgrounds like laundry women and seamstresses and whatnot. Most women's accounts of medical treatment tend to be much more negative than those of men, perhaps unsurprisingly, and they relay frustrations with their practitioners' incompetence, impatience, and even deceit. So I want to highlight a few trends that have started to kind of stand out to me. One of the most notable trends in these accounts is that medical practitioners seem to have been considerably less forthcoming with female patients than they were with male patients, forcing women to elicit details of their own illnesses from family members. So when Marie Magdalene Herbeau, for example, found a painful mass in her breast and asked her surgeon what his prognosis was, he, quote, concealed information, not wanting to respond to her precisely, and only confessed the truth to her husband in private, telling him that it was terminal cancer and that there was no point in giving her any remedies. Similarly, Anne Charlotte Bouchen, who suffered from what seems to have been a hernia, attested that her surgeon, quote, examined this ailment and said nothing in my presence about what he thought. I asked him what remedy he had for that, but he told me nothing at all, and still concealing, he left without prescribing me anything, before telling her husband later that nothing could be done. Practitioners could also conceal details when proposed treatment regimens were potentially painful or dangerous, informing family members that they would need to resort to more extreme remedies, while initially only prescribing something to which they knew the patient was likely to agree. When comparing accounts of men and women, it also seems that women were decidedly more likely than men to swear off all further treatment by medical practitioners, a decision that often stemmed from the anxiety that they experienced during medical consultations. Geneviève Collin, for example, stated that she told herself she would, quote, no longer consult anyone to spare myself the anxieties that one gave me at each consultation. She was frustrated not only with the failure of practitioners to heal her, but also that they all had different views about what was wrong with her. She said, quote, all the different sentiments of these men on this subject of my ailment proved to me that they knew nothing, up to the point that they had caused me nothing but pain, a lot of grief, a lot of worry, and made me take a lot of risks. Women were especially wary of the treatments offered by surgeons, which tended to be more invasive than those offered by physicians or apothecaries. So when Elizabeth de la Lowe suffered an injury that left her with a painful mass in one breast, practitioners tried various remedies and she claimed that she was, quote, exhausted from the remedies without the ailment diminishing. After a surgeon recommended amputation, she claimed that she, quote, no longer wanted to see any surgeon or use any more remedies. And similarly, upon the recommendation of surgical intervention, another woman reported, I thanked my surgeon for his advice, and I did not promise him I would return him. It seems clear that most of the women in these accounts were not passive victims of their practitioners. Several studies on the relationship between medical practitioners and patients during this period have shown that patients, particularly male patients, could be unruly and obstinate. Other studies have suggested that while women did tend to have some authority over practitioners, especially when it came to female-specific illnesses, it was generally upper-class women who had the most agency in medical consultations. Judging from the accounts that I've examined, even women from more humble backgrounds openly challenged the approaches of licensed medical practitioners. So when Geneviève Collin developed a painful swollen gland in the right side of her throat, she reported that a surgeon wanted to clear her gland surgically, quote, telling me it was necessary to destroy the body to remove the malady. And I responded to him that I had been destroyed enough. Although negative experiences do not fully account for the disproportionate number of women seeking miraculous cures, there were a lot more women seeking miraculous cures apparently, it is reasonable to assume that this might have been a contributing factor. Given the wide range of studies on the medical marketplace in France and elsewhere, it should come as little surprise that these patients shopped around in search of cures. consulting all manner of practitioners, including surgeons and physicians, apothecaries, empirics, and lay people who were rumored to have secret remedies for this or that illness. In many instances, saints, either popularly acclaimed or approved by the church, appear to have been just one more option in the medical marketplace. Several women reported having started to pray to saints, but not having felt any better after a few days, returned to medical practitioners only to give up on them once again and return to prayer. Patients of limited financial means often reported that they turned to miraculous healing for no other reason than that they had spent way too much money on medical services. Catherine Lefrancois, for example, decided to stop treatment and seek a cure by the intercession of the popularly acclaimed Jansenist saint, Francois de Capri, after having spoken to her apothecary, who informed her that between March of 1725 and September of 1729, she had paid for more than 70 medicines, not including opiates, creams, and prescribed wine. Another woman similarly stated that, quote, "Finally, after having spent a lot of money between their hands without anybody having cured me, I decided to renounce all remedies." And she turned to one of these popularly acclaimed saints. These are, of course, imperfect sources. Although most of the accounts are from a first-person perspective, only some of them appear to have actually been penned by the women recounting their experiences, leaving open the possibility that some details were altered by those who heard, reported, edited, or printed these accounts. The varied tone and detailed content of these accounts suggests, however, that they were not boilerplate text. Furthermore, although I can't claim that all the details are accurate, they do seem to reflect these women's experiences to a degree, at least as they later recalled them. Although some themes have emerged from the accounts that I've examined, certainly further examination of these accounts would be necessary to formulate any solid conclusions. So I've re-examined dozens of these, but there are hundreds of them, not including all the manuscript accounts that exist in places like the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal. Other types of sources will also need to be examined to give us a more balanced picture. So I've begun to examine accounts of women who recount their experiences with medical practitioners before turning to animal magnetism, for example. What does seem clear is that by reading across the grain, we can find traces of the experiences of female patients. It's surprising.